It's the morning of August 12th, 2011. I'm Michael Aron of NJTV. We are at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University in New Brunswick for the Rutgers Center on the American Governor. We're going to interview this morning for the Thomas H. Kane Archive, John Lynch. John was the mayor of New Brunswick for a dozen years. He was a state senator for 20 years. He was the Senate president for 2 years and the leader of the Democrats in the Senate for 8 years. He interacted with Governor Kane quite a bit as a senator in the 1980s, and we're going to hear all about it. Morning, John. Good to see you.
Michael, good seeing you.
Is it fair to say that you come from a political family?
Well, my father obviously was in the political world. That was it in our clan up until then. And he had gotten involved in local politics when he was a young lawyer coming out of Fordham Law School, and ultimately went on the commission form of government
Here in New Brunswick.
Transformed into a Faulkner later on. And he became the mayor for a while. And then he went into the state Senate, I guess, in 1956, I believe it was. And he ultimately became Senate President in 1965. He served 22 years, I think, in the Senate.
Did you watch the Senate from the vantage point of your living room, so to speak?
To a certain extent, sure. When I was in grade school, latter years of grade school, high school, before I went to college, I'd go down to Trenton with him once in a while. I'd hear, the discussions in the House, meet various and sundry political figures and leaders like Dick Hughes and Charlie Sandman and Dick Stout and all those characters. So that part was quite interesting. I had a sister that was my oldest sister had gotten polio, and she was in 1949 or 50, and she was confined to an iron lung that ultimately was in our house, and all the bells and whistles that go with it, with nurses and so forth. So our family became centered around her, and so my father would bring in a lot of colorful people to meet her, the athletes, the entertainers, a lot of politicos. And so we just thought that was part of the everyday life, and in retrospect, it was really interesting, and it was created a cohesive atmosphere for the family. So with all of its downside, it had the silver lining. And she lived there for like close to 20 years before she passed on.
How many siblings were there?
There were 5, and she's the only one that's deceased.
And what number were you?
2. So I became the elder.
When would you say you first started to get interested in politics?
Well, when I came out of Georgetown Law School, I decided to go back and practice with my father's firm. It was a small litigation firm. So I did a lot of litigation for a good 10 years. My father had always counseled me not to get involved in local politics because there were too many pitfalls and so forth. And I ultimately fell into the trap of getting enthusiastic about a particular issue in New Brunswick, and cast my lot and took over a campaign for somebody running for mayor, and ultimately became the municipal chairman. And then when this gentleman left and went to Wyoming, and we had beaten these entrenched interests before, I either had to run or go back to where I came from. So fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I ran for mayor in 1978, which was my first elective office.
Was your father still in the Senate at that time?
He passed away in '78. He passed away in March. I ran in the fall. He he had been sick with an oral cancer for a good 4 or 5 years. He stayed in the Senate till he, I think, 77, when he stood down and Bill Hamilton, who had been the Assembly Speaker, ran for that seat.
Was your father known in the Senate as the kind of sharp, effective operator that you were known as? Well, how was he?
I don't know
how
that
was
he was.
known?
I don't think he was an operator in the sense that that evolved with me, and unfortunately, you know, as mayor, you have a different set of duties and responsibilities. You have a lot more control, and you're trying to put an old city back together. You have to be sometimes acting semi-tyrannical with your internal bureaucracy, and to try to get the ship moving in the right direction. And so there was a lot of change. In Trenton, in the Kane years, I was like the two different people, one in City Hall and a totally different person in Trenton, where I was really interested in policy and using some of the tools I had learned as mayor. And I was fortunate to come into office at the same time that a gentleman by the name of Tom Kane did, even though he was in the other party.
We'll get to that. What was your father known for in the Senate?
Well, he was a very good lawyer. He was a quiet leader. He had a really good style. He was very well liked. He probably would have gone a lot further had it not been for my sister's circumstances, because at that time when my sister got sick, he was really rising quickly, and it changed his whole life, because he circled the wagons, and everything functioned in and around the house of my sister. As I said before, it had its good sides and its downsides. In his case, he was totally dedicated there, and it transformed his life significantly.
Did you knock down the old buildings in New Brunswick? And
we did. We started all the redevelopment. Yes. So that was that was really hard, because we weren't getting a whole lot of support from the media at that time. It was the Daily Home News and the Boyd family, and we had to overcome that. And it was very difficult when you're relocating people and assembling small properties to do a whole block, and so you have that whole dislocation problem. We've always tried to get them to do a survey to show what happened to these people and the business owners and the property owners and the tenants subsequent to their relocations, because we were convinced they all did extremely well. Save a few, because they just weren't making it in any way. But bottom line is, they were relocated extremely well, particularly the property owners and the tenants, the commercial tenants. The residential all wound up in better code meeting facilities. So a study would be nice. And unfortunately, those studies are never done. We did our own, but they're never done, and that led to the backlash against eminent domain, which was a significant tool for urban redevelopment, because it's so hard to put things together to do a remake of a city. I mean, Atlantic City is a classic example. They didn't use eminent domain for their first 20 years, and as a result, they didn't really do anything other than the boardwalk and the surrounding areas, and built a lot of monuments. But they didn't make the town a destination resort and create an environment that, when the state blessed it as a casino city, that should have been done. And so you had a local government that was functioning and going in one direction. You had a state government and casino industry going in another direction, and they were never on a common purpose.
When the buildings along Albany Street in New Brunswick were being knocked down back in the 80s, I lived in Princeton. I remember thinking, what a shame. These are gorgeous old buildings, and the whole character of the town is going to be changed. In hindsight, everybody calls New Brunswick a model of redevelopment, but how prevalent was that attitude of mind back then that you had to fight?
Well, first of all, you had the non-believers, people from the surrounding communities, and indeed across the state. Said, "What is this all about? You know, you can't go anywhere. Nobody was going to come to New Brunswick." And so you really have to change the whole environment and the psychology that goes with it. And it's a long-term sales pitch. But bottom line, insofar as the city was concerned, the downtown and all of those older buildings had once been the center of commerce and the center of tax ratables for the city. They had, that whole central business district had dwindled down to a total assessed value of something less than $25 million. So they were yielding nothing. There was very few jobs, no taxes, no activity, a government center with the city and the county government. And so it was a 8 to 4, 9 to 5 town, and you roll up the sidewalks at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, nobody would stay. The perception was it was a decaying urban city that had lost its way and could never come back, and that people didn't feel safe coming there. So it was a long process to change that whole psychology, just even for the surrounding communities here, much less the central Jersey portion and the state as a whole, before we became attractive.
You got sworn in as mayor, I guess, in 1979, if the election was in 78, and then ran for the state senate in 81, 2 years later.
Yeah.
Why, after 2 years as mayor, did you also want to be a senator?
Well, it was the fates, as in hindsight. It was, I liked the state senate. My father had been there, and I enjoyed the opportunity that I had at the time to meet and greet a lot of the people that were involved. I got a little sense of the establishment, the institution, and by chance, Bill Hamilton, who had taken my father's position in the election of 1977, and who had been shortly before that the Speaker of the Assembly, he decided to run for governor in 1981, which was the ultimate fate year for some of us, because I think the Democrats had 9 candidates. They cleared out 4 or 5 people from the Senate of leadership caliber. And so
you couldn't run for both governor and the Senate. You had to pick one, and they picked governor.
They picked governor, and they vacated. And so I had the opportunity that was sort of put in front of me. And the question is, I loved the job as mayor. And so the question was, do I try to do both? Because I really did want to go to the Senate, even though I loved the other job. So I decided to go down that road and hold both offices if I could. And that always would become an issue, and it even became an issue from time to time in the legislature. Do you have a conflict between your job as mayor and your job as a senator? Try to avoid it. In some cases to the detriment of New Brunswick, I suspect. But when I arrived at the Senate, there were a lot of young folks, newcomers. And a lot of the leadership had vacated. So it created a great opportunity for me to move along pretty rapidly in terms of leadership.
So you arrived when Tom Kean arrived as governor.
Correct.
And a few moments ago you said I believe you said you were fortunate enough to come along at a time when Kean was entering office. Did I hear you correctly?
There's no question about that. There's no question. It was.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I discovered within a relatively short period of time, I'd say it took me maybe 15 months to realize that Kean was the real deal. He was easy to work with. He was a real leader. Leadership comes in a variety of packages. Some are boisterous, some are aggressive, some are stylistically calm, cool, and collected like Tom Kean, and affable. But at the end of the day, they make decisions. They create people around them, competent people around them who are willing to make decisions. They don't have the bureaucratic mentality of a lot of the long-term government administrators who play what was commonly called the CYA game, and and so you could see things starting to mature. And Kane's style was open door, meet if you had something relevant. He'd spend the time. He could address whatever the issue was, or he would call Democrats in and talk to them about what he was concerned about and what he thought should happen. He held leadership meetings, at least once every 2 weeks, which was, and they weren't just fluff; they were real.
You weren't in the leadership yet,
No,
or were you?
No,
okay,
no, not until the second Kane term, and then I became majority leader.
You were majority leader in the second Kane term?
Yes.
So you were the number 2 Democrat in the Senate.
After 4 years.
After 4 years.
And that was a product primarily, I think, of what happened in the election of 1981 with all the Democrats vacating. And the same thing happened on the Republican side to a certain extent as well. When they had so many people running in that election, it was a free-for-all in 1981. So I was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in 2 years. Again, through fates. Persky left. He had been majority leader under Orecchio. He left after less than 2 years, and things were in motion. So chairs would be shifted, and I wound up as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in 2 years.
And you held that post for
2 years.
2 years.
Until I became majority leader.
Okay. Were you chairman of the Judiciary Committee when it considered the reappointment of Chief Justice Robert Lynch?
No, I was majority leader, so you
were on the committee.
I was on the committee.
Okay. That was so dramatic.
Well, there's a really long story associated with it. It was very traumatic for we folks, the Democrats, particularly Democrats in Middlesex County, which was the base of the Willents family. And I had known the General Willents pretty well and used to visit with him fairly frequently. And after in and around the time I became mayor of New Brunswick, and it was very, very interesting. And Robert was quite a bit different than his father.
How so?
Well, his father was a consummate. Even though he was extremely bright, he read people very well. He had a really good style, and he came across. He would be friendly. Robert was a little cold, a little gruff. People close to him would tell you he was a great guy and all, but his style, even when he was running the Willents law firm, was much different. And
so the father
not
was
that easy.
Your father was easier to get along with than the son? The father was easier to get along with?
Well, if you were smart, had something real to talk about, yes, absolutely. And he would listen, and he was pliable. He understood, like Kane. He was willing to listen. He was willing to change course on what his thinking was on a given issue. Robert was much more dogmatic, and that was his MO. And that, of course, that cost us during his reappointment, because he insisted on portraying that he had a Perth Amboy address, when in fact he had a home in Deal. He and his wife Jackie would live down there several months a year. She had gotten quite sick and was living in their co-op in New York. She had breast cancer and had gotten away. And I had gone and asked him to, actually I went to his father. I said, this train's coming down the track, we're going to get hit. And Robert's going to get hit, and we're all going to have to defend an address in Perth Amboy that's, he's got a voting address and a mailing address, but he doesn't live there, and it's not real. And I said, why don't you follow what some of we old folks remember, the Joel Jacobson model, when he avoided senatorial courtesy by moving, I believe, to Ocean County, where he had a shore house. And he was able to circumvent, for lack of a better term, the process of senatorial courtesy, because I forget what county he had had been a resident of and voted in.
Joel?
There were people there that were going to block him.
From Essex, I believe.
Yeah, they were going to block him. So he went to change his voting address to Ocean, changed his residence to Ocean. He had a home there, summer home, and it was acceptable. Tried to get Robert to do the same thing, and by going through his dad, I got a call from Robert 2 weeks later, and on certain terms told me to mind my own business. Of course, as you know, when all was said and done, and we went through all of that, those machinations that were tumultuous at times and very divisive, at the end of the day, in order to satisfy the problem and get the 21st vote to clear him through the Senate, he changed his address to Deal. All of which never would have happened. Never.
Had what?
Had he changed his voting address to Deal in the first place.
Okay. Which is what you counseled to his father.
I mean, I wasn't a genius. It was as clear as 1 and 1 is 2.
It's interesting to think that David Willents was the longtime boss of Middlesex County, a mantle you then would inherit in the 90s. In the press, you were thought of as the boss of this county, particularly by the time of the McGreevey era. Was that misplaced appellation?
That's like Nick Swisher saying he's being called Babe Ruth. No, I wasn't Dave Willents, that's for sure. Okay. He was a genius. He was a brilliant guy, and he had an enormously successful career on many fronts. His son-in-law was Leon Hess, and he obviously had a lot to do with some of his successes. And he didn't like taking credit for a lot of things. But he was a genius. I never saw anybody who was able to find the silver lining in a dark cloud. If things went wrong, he'd find a way to make it appear as if it was a winner, or in fact that at the end of the day he won in some other way. So, he never.
Was he good at PR? Is that what you mean by that?
No, the inside. The inside.
In other words, actually getting a silver lining out of something.
And when he became an elder statesman, leader of the party, and a de facto leader of the party, I think there was no PR. I don't think he had any day-to-day interaction with the media at all.
What did you work on with Tom Kean? What issue, what policy tops that? I'm sure there were many, but what comes to mind?
Well, I think the first thing we worked on was urban enterprise zones. And we had differences which we were able to sort out. He was actually, I forget who his point person was on that, but he would attend meetings and made the compromises that needed to be done to effectuate a bill that would pass and that he would sign. It wasn't a perfect bill, and he easily could have been right about things that he was saying. We had real political issues on our side because every city wanted to be one of the zones, and so you had to sort of categorize some of the benefits. I had my first conflict with mayor and senator because New Brunswick, we were one of those that could have been in the original bill, but I felt that some of the bigger cities and a more regional balance was appropriate at the time. You couldn't put too many in at the time, so we took a pass in New Brunswick, and ultimately they became an enterprise zone 20 years later, I think, or thereabouts. Yeah, roughly 20 years later. We could have used the tool in the urban redevelopment of New Brunswick, but it wasn't an essential tool because we were already in motion.
What do you think about dual office holding? It's come to be thought of as almost an abuse, and yet there's a school of thought that said it made sense for citizens to have a mayor who could go down to the State House and get things done for them.
And to have a mayor and to have a senator or a legislator who understands government and the functioning of government, because legislators don't run a government. They're not involved in the day-to-day operations of a government unless you see it in its workings and understand the psychology of the people that work in government and how and why things work and don't work. You're kind of guessing. You're going along with the winds, as it were. So it has some distinct advantages. It certainly has some advantages for the host town, city, whatever, where you have the dual office holder, but it does have abuses. There's no question. The abuses that are portrayed are, two salaries. Of course, if you're essentially a full-time mayor, because you're doing 40-hour weeks plus, even if you're in the legislature, it isn't about the money. I didn't even do 25 years to take benefits, health benefits and such, and never had any other public job, city attorneys or planning boards or the pension builders and so forth and so on. So you have it. You can look at each dual office holder and see different characteristics and different goals and objectives. You had a Frank Graves, for instance, from Patterson. He went to Trenton, and he was Mr. Law and Order, but he also brought something to the table for Trenton, and at the same time, he had a fervor constantly for Patterson, and so 90% of what he was doing was good for the best interest of the state.
Do you think it was wrong for the state to do away with dual office holding?
No, you know why? Because sometimes the public perception becomes such that you have to do things, regardless of the substance. And because, where they say perception becomes reality, and I think in the case of dual office holding, it had outlived its usefulness because you were being portrayed in such a way that it would hurt your ability to perform. And so why? There's always someone else to come along and take your position if who's just as good or better if it's done right. And which is another thing that Tom Kean talked about frequently was the continuity of an agenda, the continuity of leadership. Problems we have in the cities is that there's change taking place in leadership quite frequently. You go 4 years with one mayor or 8 years, and then you go in another direction, and it's constantly going back and forth. I represented, when I was in the state senate for a number of years, Plainfield, a wonderful city, but they had a change of leadership every 4 years, and whatever the mayor did for 4 years, the next mayor would go in the opposite direction. Well, you can't redevelop a city that way. You have to have a blueprint. It has to be followed. And I think Kean had expressed that in a number of ways, even with the state government, that if you have something working and is functioning correctly, the next governor shouldn't turn around and say, well, it wasn't mine, so I'm heading in a different direction. And that's a problem. I mean, it's a problem with business. It's a problem with government. If you have change taking place for change's sake and leadership determining to go in a separate direction just because they're the new leader, that doesn't work.
When did you first meet Tom Kean, do you recall?
Well, I knew a lot about him, but for people that had worked with him in the Bateman campaign in '77, and my father knew him casually.
He ran against Bateman
in the primary of
'77.
Right. I think he finished second.
Right.
And may have been fortunate for Tom that way. That there were issues and problems and so forth at the time, and then we had a recession, and timing. Besides being very good, timing is very, very important.
You say your father knew him?
Oh yeah. But I got to know him. The first time I met him to speak to him was when, and we've all heard these stories, when I was mayor of New Brunswick and he was running for the governor. And I think he called himself and asked to stop by because I know he was visiting the city mayors. And he came to City Hall. We spent, I don't know, 40 minutes, 45 minutes. He wasn't looking for our support. That was understood. Without saying, he wanted to talk about issues and the cities and make it clear who he was and what he was. And you know, it ultimately the strategy, not because he met with me or other mayors, because he spent time in the cities in his election, that he was not the enemy. He was friendly, and so you know it's harder to turn out big pluralities in the cities when you don't have somebody to be throwing bricks at. And Kaine was very good at that, very good, and he was sincere. And as it turned out, it wasn't just a campaign ploy. That's who he was, and that's how he treated you down in Trenton when he became governor. Even when he was doing so very, very well, he didn't change who he was and what he was. He had his agenda, and he wanted to get it done. And he was decisive in his way, and he wanted to have the balls moving. And he stood. You knew exactly where Tom Kaine was coming from, and in retrospect, it's even clearer. All the things that he was doing really had to do with the image of the state and economic development, whether it was the arts, whether it was higher ed, whether it was the research institutions, the sci-tech institutions, the Community Development Bond Act, the Transportation Trust, the Wastewater Trust, now Environmental Trust. All of those things, when you put them together as a composite, they all translated into a bottom line for the state in terms of economic development. There's no better engine for economic development in the long term of the state than higher ed and the undergraduate, graduate, and research components. And since Tom Kaine has left, there's been a total lack of focus, it seems to me, on higher ed and what it really means to the state and its future. He got it. I mean, obviously it had to do with his background, his education, his teaching, and his having served in the assembly and functioning as a leader there, knowing all the players, and really rolling up his sleeves and getting his hands dirty from time to time in those roles. So he wasn't above the fray at all.
Was he the best governor you saw?
No doubt. No, it's not even debatable. You knew exactly what his agenda was. I see governors come and go, and they have agendas that are geared around a campaign issues. You know, the Republicans, and Tom Kaine included, run on taxes and crime. If you poll their Republican issues, the social issues, the education, so forth, typically are on the Democratic side, and that's where their strength is. If you can neutralize Republicans on crime and taxes, Democrats win. So Kaine, I mean, his campaigns, his first campaign clearly had crime and taxes, and while he stuck to his campaign promises, his agenda as governor in the big picture, not on things that move voters, but for the betterment of the state over the long haul, his agenda was the big picture and economic development in higher ed, in the research institutions, in the arts, which throw off a lot of resources, and which also contributed to urban redevelopment, and all of the programs that he put together to support those things.
When you think about individual programs or agencies or bills from the Kaine era, what are the one or two or three big things that
Well, I mean, the Higher Education Bond Act and the sci-tech centers. He appointed me to the sci-tech commission originally. They had some fabulous people. Jack Ewing and I were on it as the legislative appointments from the Senate per Kaine. But we were amongst a lot of giants. I mean, these people were serious about cranking the state up, about bringing in capital, about attracting new businesses, about creating incubators. things that have proven effective for the state. And Tom totally understood it. I should call him Governor Kane, but I just feel, he always was a friend. He was always affable. He was always kind, and so you treat him. You think he's part of the family somehow. He's quite a unique character.
Did you ever have any partisan political fights with him?
Oh, we'd argue over particular issues, but he wasn't into that. He'd tell you why he was not for something. Like we had the Fair Housing Act. The Republicans in 1985, when Tom ran for re-election against Peter Shapiro, I mean, he could have thrown his hat in the ring and he would have won, but he did all the parts. At the same time, Chuck Hardwick was looking to take over the assembly, and they put on the ballot on a non-binding referenda in like 150 suburban towns a constitutional amendment on Mount Laurel, which people perceived to be a civil rights piece of legislation, for lack of a term, by Robert Willans in the Supreme Court in the Mount Laurel case. And there was a lot of unrest. They're going to change our neighborhoods, they're going to change all this. And they attracted enormous votes from the suburbs in 1985, which contributed to the enormity of the win by the governor and, of course, by Chuck Hardwick in the assembly. So everybody understood, however, we had to get this out of the courts because that was creating more unrest than we could tolerate. So we created the Fair Housing Act. And he and I had bargained over, I wanted something for the urbans because we have the same need for home ownership. And what people don't understand about Mount Laurel and the affordable housing issue, it's not a HUD program. These people have to be income earners. They have to be people who can qualify for a mortgage, just like you or I. It's just that they can't qualify for a big enough mortgage to support this house. So, for instance, today, a family of 4 in Somerset County making $93,000 qualifies for a moderate income house. Public doesn't get that. I mean, this was about providing real housing for people that work in the community, for people who work for the community, who otherwise don't have an opportunity and would have to live elsewhere and maybe much less standards. And so we wanted a piece of that in the urban. So we worked on with Kane himself the regional contributions agreements and so forth. And a lot of people who were on the civil rights side of this and viewed Mount Laurel as a civil rights case, which is definitely not, wanted no part of that. We want people moving to the suburbs. The perception was they're going to move out of New Brunswick and move to Bedminster. It's nonsense. These people that live in the urbans have their families, their friends, their banks, their stores, their churches. They're not uprooting. They want their own opportunity. Those same people making $50,000, $60,000 that qualify for a low-income house or townhouse, they're in the urbans just like they are in the suburbans. And that's what that was all about. When it was ultimately disbanded, it was done by someone who I know and who always considered this to be a civil rights case and always considered this to be a HUD program where you're subsidizing housing. You're subsidizing the purchase, so you're in effect buying down the mortgage. That's all you're doing. So the mortgage may turn out to be, $150,000 as opposed to $250,000, but you got to pay the mortgage. You got to pay the taxes. You got to pay the maintenance.
So was the Fair Housing Act, which from the vantage point of today has been discredited because of the COA bureaucratic tangle that grew out of it.
That's it.
But was it a sort of moderate, middle-of-the-road response to what Tom Kane called the communistic Mount Laurel decision of the Supreme Court? Is that?
Well, it's interesting. Kane had a great relationship with Robert Willans, and indeed was absolutely the one responsible for getting Robert Willans reconfirmed. Didn't have to be that way, but there's no doubt that Kane did that. And when he ultimately got Lee Laskin to vote, and he had made some other arrangements. But it's interesting when he has this close relationship and he calls it communistic. Well, the opinion was so long and convoluted that which leads to some of the perceptions by the left and the right that it was either communistic or a civil rights decision. It was neither. It was an affordable housing issue that was really about providing some home ownership opportunities for real workers, not.
When you say it didn't have to go that way, you mean if Robert once had changed his residence?
Exactly.
Okay. Who did you work with in the Kane administration most closely?
Well, I mean, there were 2 terms, and I had 2 different roles. In the first term, I was I'd worked through the Judiciary Committee on people with appointments and things like that. I worked on an issue like urban enterprise zone with Kane. I forget who else. And there were a multitude of relatively, by today's standards, insignificant issues that I was able to work with the front office on. Carrie Edwards. We had a really good relationship. But I remember much more because of being directly involved on a day-to-day basis with the administration when I became majority leader in January of '86. And I'll never forget, we had Michael Cole, who I had met before when he was director of Division of Law in the Attorney General's operation. But I didn't really know him. And I met with him after the election when he was taking over as the chief counsel. And easygoing guy, very, very good lawyer, good insight, but had a lot of Kane style to him, easy to work with, didn't get ruffled. That didn't mean when you were, somebody left the room, he didn't have something to say, but we all do that. But he said that the governor wanted to meet with John Russo and I about the second term, and he was up in the Newark office, and we went up there with Michael. And Kane said, and I'll never forget, he said, look, I have 5 or 6 things I want to get done in my second term. And he started laying them out. He said, I want you to really work on them and see if you can support those issues. He said,
he said to the Democratic leadership?
He said to John Russo and myself, he said, you tell me what you folks want to get done in the next 4 years, and give it to me. And if it's plausible, not only will I sign, but I will help you pass the bills. I'll help you get support from the editorial boards of the various newspapers, which of course he was famous for, with the exception of one newspaper, which I won't mention. But he would stop by when he was in Newark to the Star Ledger and have a cup of coffee with the editor, and just unannounced. And it was not only shrewd, but he was looking at a way to cultivate support, bounce things off of them in advance of his announcements and where he was headed. And I don't have to tell you the psychology of that, how important that is. There are others who were counseled to do similar things that would not over the years, but I'm not going to get into that. I mean, again, it follows what Governor Kane said. If it works, why not support it? Why not keep going? Somebody comes along after him and they start going in a total different direction. We were on a really good course.
During that second term?
His 8 years. I mean, everybody says the same thing. We all know that the pundits were criticizing the Kane administration because they were moving slowly in the first year, and things weren't happening. I've seen and read different analysis of why and so forth. I mean, it's not easy to get your arms around the state government, to get new people in terms of taking over various departments, categories, staff, planning, legal, the whole package, and then to create a synergy to make it all start moving down the road. And I'm sure some of the changes that were made were important to that process, but the process always plays that way. If you look at the first year of almost every governor, we've had those kinds of issues. Going back to, in my lifetime, to a burn. I don't remember the first Dick Hughes year. I think I was away at school anyhow.
You weren't in Trenton during the Byrne administration, but how do you regard the Byrne administration?
Well, they were much different people. Byrne was faced with the financial issues and the tax need for a tax and so forth. Ironically, they were both from Essex, based in Essex, but they were two different people, style-wise and otherwise. I like Brendan, don't get me wrong. I think Tom had a much better handle on the big picture and was less mired into parochial politics. Even though Tom Kean was a brilliant politician, he comes in this package that people think, oh, he's a patrician and he doesn't know anything about the street. He was on the street. He just talks differently and maybe acts a little differently, but he understood the political world, how to get things done better than anybody I've ever seen. And part of that helped him was the way he looked and sounded and his style, because nobody believed that he could be a real political operative, and he was in his own way. Smart. He understood what was going on the ground.
Do you think that the South Africa divestiture bill that he signed was a major part of his legacy or a minor part of it?
I suspect it's minor.
Okay.
Things were all
moving
in motion. And I mean, it had nothing to do with his heart, but as you know, Tom always was concerned, and rightfully so, about the business community, big business, small business, and how they perceived New Jersey. So I'm sure he wrestled with the impacts, because no matter what it was, whether it was raising a tax or whatever, he was the first one to sing the tune in New Jersey that I've ever heard, who said, look, we cannot be non-competitive when it comes to our tax structure. We always have to keep in mind New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and so forth, because people will be exiting. And more importantly, we're doing all these things with higher ed and research and incubators and sci-tech. We want to attract people, and including the financial sector, to New Jersey, and the CEOs and the hierarchy of these operations will not come here if your income tax is too high. And so you got to be very careful about it.
Do you agree with that?
I understood it. I totally agree with it now. I mean, before he was done, I agreed with it totally. And it's clear as the nose on your face. The problem with the issue is simple. When you poll the public generally, and they say, we want you to tax people making over $500,000 or wherever it is, they say, absolutely. And when they go to the ballot box, I don't think it's a cutting issue. I really don't. But more importantly, from a public policy standpoint, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face, because New Jersey did become non-competitive, partially because of our tax structure, and in many ways because of our government structure, where we have such redundancy in government. 566 towns, 610 school districts. Nobody else has that. 70 towns in Bergen County, each with their own sewer department, their own equipment, their tax assessors, police departments, all the bells and whistles that go with it. 70 of them. Doesn't make any sense. Nobody else has anything like that. And so we wonder where our money goes. It goes because of the redundancy.
You said a little while ago that what Tom Kean was all about was improving New Jersey's image and economic development. What happened to the state's image during the Kean years?
Well, listen, I think if you're in the shower once in a while, you'll even remember singing New Jersey and You Perfect Together, I mean, he was, even though a whole different style, he was Reagan-esque in that he was always pretty positive. He preached a good tune publicly. He was positive about the future of the state, positive about the direction he was setting. Reagan was more of a cheerleader, and I don't think as substantive as Tom Kean. But they had a lot in common that way. They really did. Reagan was more into the symbols of crime and taxes and so forth. But at the end of the day, he was also a governor, and he understood what he had to do. You know, he raised taxes 4 or 5 times. He raised the debt ceiling 7, 8 times. He did what he had to do, but he was able to do, like Kean, he was able to work with the other side. He had Tip O'Neill and people. He'd go in and make his own deals to get what he wanted, at the same time to, you know, to satisfy the other side of the aisle. Now, Kean was brilliant at that. I mean, he probably could have got over on us if, you know, because you trusted him so much after a while. You knew he was serious about what he was doing.
Was he successful in getting the state to feel better about itself and to look better to the outside?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it. I think our image started to change across the Hudson. He worked well with the people in the city, the leadership in the city, and the governors of New York, Port Authority. Did a lot of things there. He was a big picture guy, but you can't be a big picture guy unless you're willing to delegate and bring in some people who you can trust to move the ball. Sure, you have to be aware of what they're doing. Sure, you can't let them run amok, but as long as they're going down a course that you generally agree with, you've got to give them some latitude and some rope. So he wasn't micromanaging, but at the same time, he knew the direction. And so he would address the things that he knew he could or should, like the interaction with New York, like developing those kinds of relationships. So when you need to get something done at the port, et cetera, you could get it done. And you can't be fighting across the rivers, whether it be the Delaware or the Hudson. You can't do that. And we have proven too many times it doesn't work.
Who were the most important legislators of that era, of the Kean era? Who were the people most important to you as Senate Majority Leader? Or as Senate
Well, we had our own in our own caucus, you know. Of course, John Russo was the Senate President. And we had some up-and-coming folks around. The Republicans had John Dorsey and Bill Gormley and Donnie D. and DeFrancesco. People who understood the picture, understood the direction. Interestingly enough, I think to some extent we had a better relationship with Kean than some of the Republicans. And it might have been because we were the majority.
He had to work with
I can't speak for the Assembly, where Alan Karcher, of course, was the consummate pit bull. And that's not a knock on Alan. He was a very bright guy and understood the process, understood Trenton very well. But I think the contrast between his style and Kean's style helped Kean a lot in the early years of Tom Kean, because Alan was always attacking and Kean was always playing soft and gentle and sticking to his agenda and his message, and never got down into the nitty-gritty of the attacks.
Alan Karcher.
I'm sure there are people that disagree with me, but I think off the record, if Tom were to assess this, Alan was an asset for him.
I don't think you're the first one to say that in this room for this archive. Alan was your fellow Middlesex County Democrat.
He was a Middlesex County Democrat until he moved to Mercer County.
Right. As you have now.
As I now have.
And he was probably the most flamboyant legislative leader of that decade. Would you agree with that?
Oh, there's no question. No, there's no question. Alan liked that role, and he was good at it. But it's like different horses for different courses, and depending on who you're running the race against. And when you're running against somebody like Tom Kean, who's the governor, and his style is such that you're just enhancing his image. It doesn't work. If you were doing that against, if he was doing that against the current governor, it'd be a whole different ballgame.
Why did Tom?
That might have been more interesting.
Because the current governor is
similar in style.
Similar in style. Okay. Why did Tom Kean beat Peter Shapiro in 1985 by a record margin?
Well, first of all, we had gone through the economic malaise of the end of the Carter administration, the oil embargoes, the housing collapse with the condominiums running amok, the savings and loans going down, a lot of unrest with the people, unemployment up, and which Reagan, of course, experienced in his first 2 years in 1981 and 82. If you look at Reagan's numbers at the end of 82, he was still upside down. Then things started to go north in the economy and in the perception of the positiveness of the direction of the country. Reagan was a great cheerleader. Tom was a great cheerleader in his own right. And people became very happy with where we were headed. In the meantime, the Democrats helped Kean enormously because at the end of his first year in 1982, he wanted to pass a penny on the gas tax, and he couldn't get some. We provided some votes, and he couldn't get a couple of the Republicans to vote for it, and I think it wound up with 20 votes in the Senate. I think it was Joe Bubba and maybe Connors who he couldn't budge. And I'm not sure that Kean didn't have this in the back of his head that it would work in a different way. So the Democrats, with Allen, et cetera, then after that failed, insisted on raising the sales tax by a penny and elevating graduating the income tax a little bit. And this all occurred at the end of 82 before the economy was really headed north. So all of a sudden we have a broader based tax structure and now an economy that's headed north. And so cash was coming through the door significantly. Timing is everything, but I'd like to think that the Governor Kean understood what was really going on and what this would mean at the end of the day. He did say that even though he didn't like the income tax, the elevation, that it still did not make us non-competitive with New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and to that extent he was right. Things started to really go in the right direction. His programs were kicking in. He was getting lots of media attention on all of his programs, whether they be the higher ed, the sci-tech, the bond issues that were moving down the road, economic development across the board, in which he was preaching very well. And then, of course, we had the infamous Mount Laurel, which exacerbated the problem that the Democrats had, as the Assembly Democrats will admit, because people who had won, like in our district in the 17th, fortunately the Senate wasn't running at 85, but the Assembly was, and our people had won in 1983 in the Assembly by about 8,000 votes, 8,500 votes roughly. They won by less than 1,000 votes in 85. A huge differential. And there were, the turnouts were coming from the suburban towns enormously. So it was a combination of things. Don't get me wrong, Governor Kean would have beaten Shapiro without Mount Laurel and without things going in the right direction in Washington. But it would not have been an all-time high where we won few towns. Handful of towns in the state, I think.
Right.
It was crazy.
By the end of the Kean era, your stature was pretty high in the legislature. You say you were majority leader. People started talking about you running for governor, maybe in '89. Maybe again in '97.
I was long gone by 97.
You were?
89 was the time.
Okay.
And I had planned for it. I mean, planned in the sense of getting prepared to a certain extent. But I always knew when Florio took a pass on running against Kane in 85 that he was coming back. And he continued to get good media attention coming out of Washington, whether it be the environmental issues or the insurance issues, which seemed to be his two bellwethers that registered politically in New Jersey. And so when you polled in New Jersey along those roads from 85 through 88 and into early 89, Florio's numbers were big. And unless you had an enormous amount of money and some cutting issues, you weren't going to beat him in a primary. And I had an exploratory committee in 89, and we did some homework and started working in the vineyards, and then did some polling, and it was clear there was no way you couldn't beat Florio in a primary. Now Alan Karcher ran, and my old friend Barbara Sigmund ran, and Florio won easily. It was an impossible task.
Was it? It was just a realistic assessment of the situation, and you felt he was going to win, and so you decided not to go.
Yeah, I didn't have the political machinery. I had some other personal issues, but the reality is I would have run were it not for Florio's being involved, and he was literally unbeatable the way we saw it, not just me, political consultants, etc. That there was no way to beat him.
So you became Senate President at that point.
Yes.
John Russo stepped aside, or?
Well, he did 4 years.
He did his 4 years, okay.
That was, at the time, that was the norm until they did campaign finance reform to ensure the continuing power of the Senate President.
Did you enjoy being Senate President?
Not as much as I enjoyed being mayor, and I stood down as mayor to do that. I couldn't do both jobs at the same time, so I really loved being mayor. It was my best job.
Really?
It was really hands-on. You could move the ball. Sure, there were a lot of days when you'd kick the garbage can, or the water cooler, as they say. But the reality is that you can make a difference daily. In the legislature, the leadership in many, many cases is it's like herding cats. You have all these egos. You have to take care of people on their personal side, on their legislative side, on their campaigns, and so forth. And don't get me wrong, I made a lot of really good friends, and I enjoyed it. But it's a whole different ballgame, and you're not in control of real decision making. We fancy the legislature as under our separation of powers as having equal power to the judiciary and the executive. Indeed, using all the tools you have available to you in the legislature still doesn't put you in a position to be on a par with the governor's office, because the governor has not only enormous power under the Constitution of New Jersey, but they have the pulpit, and the pulpit counts for a lot if you do it right. And you're going to attract the first paragraph. You're going to attract the cut on the nightly news that you want. Those kinds of things. Where in the legislature it's very difficult, and at the same time to get your members to support what it is you're doing. It's kind of like Congress today. How do you get them to come together on anything?
So after 2 years as Senate President, the Republicans won control of both houses because of the Florio tax hike backlash. Am
Yes.
I correct?
Yes.
And you stayed on as Democratic leader, minority leader.
Correct.
In the Senate for another 6 years, I believe.
Till 97, when I said I wasn't going to run again after that. Yeah.
How was that experience? 91 to 97.
It wasn't fun.
Number one Democrat in
It
a
wasn't
minority.
fun. I enjoyed the interaction with the Republicans in the legislature. I did not enjoy the interaction with the administration. I didn't have a great relationship with the Florio administration either, but in the Whitman administration, unlike the Kane administration, they brought in a lot of people that were, let's call them rookies, and had no understanding of what they were about, what was going on. Some of the cabinet people were good, but the people you deal with on a day-to-day basis was a whole different agenda. And Governor Whitman, who I had a relationship with when she was a freeholder in Somerset County, turned out to be more interested in national politics than the state. I'll just give you an example as to contrast her style with Keene. After they passed the lowering of the taxes, the so-called Florio taxes, which we tried to wipe out in lame duck, almost did, so they could start fresh and pass whatever taxes they wanted to.
Lame duck right before Whitman took office?
Right, exactly. We passed it in the Senate, and we almost passed it in the Assembly. I doubt that Florio would have signed it, but who knows. But in any event, Governor Whitman and her forces were able to accomplish the lowering of the taxes to great applause. They didn't lower them to where they were, but they took a middle ground. And because they needed the revenue. And that was fine. And her poll numbers were way up there. And they were talking about her as a national star in the Republican Party, and but she was a moderate, and there wasn't quite as much contentiousness from the right as there is today. But there was, obviously. There always has been, but it has escalated. And one day, her office called and asked if I would go over to Drumthwacket in the afternoon for a cup of coffee and spend some time with her. This is maybe 3-4 months into her term. Her poll numbers are going north. She got done the tax issue and some other, the budget. Budget was in process. It wasn't even done yet, that's right. And so I figured she wanted to talk about, like a Kane would, about, okay, what's her agenda going to be? And we had exchanged pleasantries about the old days and so forth. And then she said that she started talking about some minor issues. I said, look, I enjoyed my tenure with Tom Keene, and we were able to be helpful. If you have a real agenda and you want to get some things done that are for the state, and you want to leave your legacy there, that's fine. Because you now have enormous political capital, and you're going to spend it somehow. Or you're going to spend it on, New Jersey and doing things that should be done here. Fixing some of the bureaucratic problems, fix some of the redundancies, the structural issues, and so forth and so on. Or if you're going to be looking to run for national office, and you're just going to be doing fluff, then it's a different game. If you're serious, we're fine. If you're not, we're not.
This was just you and her?
Just the two of us. And she did a sort of a humana on that, and went on to her agenda. The only thing she talked to me substantively that day was that she thought it was time to have term limits for prosecutors. Let me translate that for you. They had a Somerset County prosecutor who was in serious trouble. Nick Bissell, and was hanging on. And obviously they didn't want to torpedo him in any public way. So the nice way to do it would be to have a term limit bill for prosecutors, because they already served 12 years, I think, or more at that time. And I said, look, you're never going to get this passed in the legislature if we initiate it. I said, but we need it helpful to you to get a bill passed that's about a prosecutors that you can conditionally veto and add that provision. And as fate would have it, later on, within a couple of months, under state mandate, state pay, the prosecutor pay scale came along, because the counties were paying the prosecutor, but his salary was tied to the state's portrayal of what judges make. So the judges get a raise, the prosecutor gets a raise. So the question was, okay, if you give the prosecutor a raise through the state legislation, then the counties ought to be reimbursed for the prosecutor, additional pay to the prosecutor. Not a whole lot. but it was easy to pass. Goes to her desk. She's out of town, and Peter Venero says, I forgot about it. And they had Donnie D sign the bill. Just the pay raise. No term limit for prosecutors. Now, was it a good bill? Term limits? I don't know. You can cut that both ways. But her mission was very provincial, parochial. Had nothing to do with a substantive issue. And that's why I was there that day. And I walked out of there and said, this isn't going to be fun.
You say you wanted to see whether she was going to be serious or do the fluff that it would take to enhance the national reputation.
Yes.
You can't be serious and get things really done and enhance a national reputation at the same time?
Certainly not as easy, because if you're tackling the substantive issues of the state, the redundancies that I talked about before, et cetera, and you're going to make some enemies. You're going to have people lining up on both sides of that because you have the interest groups that are going to be offended by any of this. We've just gone through some of that, and we've seen it. I saw it when I was tackling the NJEA many moons ago. So those things automatically happen. So your political capital needs to be spent on getting some of that done if you're going to be moving the state in the right direction. Now, Kane was able to do it in a different way because of his style, et cetera. He had cooperation, maybe the timing was good. But a lot of it had to do with the fact he knew what he wanted to do. Now, was he going to tackle the high, hard ones? I don't know. Some of what he did tackle was very hard. And, you know, for instance, in the higher ed game, when he went to college autonomy, and he had programs to support flexibility for the Board of Trustees, Board of Governors at the universities. And some of them took enormous advantage of it. And a lot of people screamed. For instance, college in New Jersey. How can you let them become a college of excellence? They're a state college. Oh, okay, they're supposed to be mediocre, I guess. And the unions and others railed about it. As a matter of fact, ultimately, they took the president out, Eichhoff, who had created all this, and did an enormous job for the College of New Jersey. And he would have never been able to do any of it were it not for Tom Kean and some of the people that work for Kean, as a shining example of what could be done and what was done because of the autonomy and the flexibility that was, and some additional resources that were breathed into the system by Kean to support creativity by the colleges. So you saw an era when our higher education institutions and research institutions went north significantly. That hasn't happened since. Nobody since then has gotten back on that agenda.
So while you were becoming disillusioned with Christy Whitman, you were also becoming, if you weren't already, the mentor to Jim McGreevey. Fair comment?
Well, there is a perception in the press that I was his mentor, because of the perception that I was the leader of Middlesex County. And while I spent a lot of time with McGreevey, and I talked to him a lot about issues, and I was impressed with his skills that he demonstrated in the Senate, and some of the things he'd been able to accomplish in Woodbridge, I knew that he was a real retail politician. And he was willing to work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, touching, feeling people, political people, local government people, citizens on the street. He'd rather go to the McDonald's in Newark than stop and see the editor at the Star-Ledger, you know, those kinds of things. And we ran into trouble, the two of us, because I had made the comment that, you know, he should want to be respected, not loved. And, you know, got very upset about that.
He did?
Yes.
At what point in time was that?
Well, he was governor already.
Okay.
But you know, we see this coming. We were hoping that when he got to be governor, he would be decisive. He would, because he understood the issues. He could articulate.
You helped him become governor.
Only in the sense that we had real strength in Middlesex County. We had helped organize him in which is another funny story, in '97 when he ran for. '97, he ran for in the primary.
Right. He won the primary.
And he won the primary by 8,000 votes over Rob Andrews, which is kind of an upset. Hudson was with Andrews, but we learned the primary process, so there's only 5 or 6 big Democratic counties that turn out votes in a primary, and you have to have three of them. Andrews had a huge turnout from Camden, and he had Hudson County. We had Essex, Middlesex, Union. At that time, Bergen was a minor player. Mercer was a minor player. They were like the second tier. And it was kind of an upset, and we ran a good race without a lot of funds. And then we had the general election, and Whitman was asleep at the switch. And interestingly enough, the funny story, I won't mention names, but some people came to me, and the people who really were McGreevy's mentors, and came to me early on that year in '97 and said, we want to run, maybe it was late '96, we want to run McGreevy. And maybe he can't beat Whitman, but he'll rise, and he'll be elevated, and he can run the following term. And I said, her numbers are through the roof, and they had to learn that he ran a terrible campaign in '93 against Florio, and they should have beat him by 15 points at least, and they barely won. Less than 100,000 votes, I think. I said, but I'll tell you what, let me go spend some time checking with some of my Republican friends who were involved and who understand, to see if they're bringing in the first team this time, as opposed to what they did in '93, having learned maybe. And I went and spent a couple of months, because you can't get information every day. And much to my surprise, it was the same game, the same team, the same, not new consultants, not new leadership to run the campaign. And I went back to McGreevy's real mentors and said, I'm in. You can't get hurt. If you get destroyed like Peter Shapiro got destroyed, you're not running again. Which, they set up, it could have been that kind of a race. Not as big, but big enough that you're done. So we went back, and the race got underway, and sure enough, the Whitman campaign did exactly what it did the first time, made the same mistakes, fell into the arguments over, auto insurance and so forth and so on. And McGreevy was like a one-trick pony, and he almost won. If we had money, we'd have won. And they salvaged at the end of the race with scaring the seniors on a Medicare stuff. It was brilliant. High Time was involved. It was brilliant. They turned the last week of the race, because all the momentum was going the other way. And I don't have to tell you how close it was. So that's how the world works sometimes. But I say that because I want you to know that I wasn't the architect or the mentor for Jim McGreevy, which has always been stated.
4 years later, when McGreevy is the putative nominee of the party and Bob Torricelli decides that he'd like to be the governor or run for governor, you were the front person for the Save McGreevy campaign. I remember I did a show where you were half the show and George Norcross was half the show, arguing for Torricelli.
I think you were in my den.
Yeah, I think so. It was one of the best shows I ever had.
Oh God!
So you stepped out front to save McGreevy at that point, did you not?
Yeah, it must be my culture, because I've never had a good relationship with Bob Torricelli. And so the motivation was very strong.
And you did have a good relationship with George Norcross, and there the two of you were on opposite sides of the fundamental question.
Definitely. Definitely.
So when McGreevy was successful in 2001, how much a part of that were you?
Well, I was involved in the campaign, helping with fundraising, some planning, not a whole lot. I think I actually had more of an involvement in the '97. But I was involved, there's no doubt, in some of the orchestrations, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff, some of the moving of people and making sure they're planning and so forth. But the campaign consultants and some of the other first team operatives of McGreevy were running all the day-to-day. and making those kinds of decisions.
And then there was the sense during the first year or two of McGreevy that you were almost like a puppet master, that you could get the administration to do what you thought it should do. That may be a myth, a press myth as well, but can you speak to that?
Well, it was difficult because, again, like in the Christie Whitman example, he had a lot of political capital because he was very popular. People liked him. He was articulate. He worked the streets from one end of the state to the other. And he was getting mired into internal politics and trying to satisfy everybody instead of taking the Kane model and saying, here's my agenda, here's what I want to do. And you can fit some of these things in accordance with that, fine, but don't give me this turf stuff on every broad-based public policy issue I want to get done. And he got mired into that, and that was very, very difficult to absorb. Again, lead with whatever style you have. Lead, make decisions.
You were disappointed in him as a leader, I take it.
Exactly.
The line, also a press line, I don't know if it was true or just one of those myths, was he promised 11 different people they could be attorney general. Is there any truth to that, or was that just symptomatic of the problem?
No, there was an issue with regard to attorney general, but it had more to do with, again, some of the parochial, provincial folks not wanting somebody. That's all there was. And because I think when they decided, or when the name Sampson came up in the context of the alternative, that it was universally agreed on.
That Sampson was a good choice for attorney general.
Yeah,
even though he was a Republican.
Even though he was a Republican, he was a quality lawyer, and he had gotten friendly to the McGreevy and the people around McGreevy. And the only downside to Sampson was he articulated, to his credit, that he wasn't going to stay more than a year and a half, something like that. But he would get them off and running.
You left the legislature during this period of time.
I left. I didn't run in 2001.
Why not?
Oh, I had it announced since '97. I had it. I wasn't going to go. I wasn't going to go as long as my father. 20 years was enough. That's why I stood down.
How long had he gone?
22. Uh-huh. And I was ready to move on. It was getting a little more difficult to function. And I had gotten out. The only thing I really did in the last 4 years was the Venero hearings, first for Supreme Court, and then the lead up to impeachment in the context of racial profiling. And we did a lot of work, a lot of work. Not necessarily to any great avail, although I'll say this, in the racial profiling hearings, we got to the bottom line of what was really going on, and it really all had to do with consent searches. And the consent searches have almost universally ended, and so the profiling issue is actually stopped being a major issue on our highways.
Just refresh our memory a little bit. The consent search was when a state trooper stopped a minority motorist on the turnpike and
stopped anybody
and asked for consent to search, which implied I'm going to search you whether you.
There was a Supreme Court case back in the U.S. Supreme Court in the 60s, late 50s, or early 60s, prior to which the fruits of an illegal search could not be used as evidence in a federal case, but they could be used in a state case. And that case said you can no longer use the fruits of an illegal search as evidence in a state trial. Fundamental constitutional right under the U.S. Constitution, which preempts any state law or constitutional provision. As a consequence of which, the style of investigations, be they for racketeering, bookmaking, searching a vehicle, drugs, what have you, changed. And in the first several years, a lot of evidence was thrown out prior to trial, and convictions couldn't be made. Cases were being thrown out left and right. What was happening, unfortunately, was that a lot of the law enforcement was led to make believe that they had done things they didn't do. The evidence was in plain sight, and so they had these contentious suppression motions prior to trial going on and on and on and on throughout the state. And finally, somebody, I don't know who landed on it, we're better off if we determine that we can have a consent search, which is really a misnomer, because what they do is they cajole, for lack of a better term. I know a colleague of yours who was stopped on a motorcycle on the New York Thruway, and he said, yeah, I had to authorize a consent search, but they told me I'd be sitting there for the next 12 hours and I'd be down in headquarters for another 2 days. And I said, well, go ahead. And I mean, you're not telling me that we had examples, for instance, of where they found kilos of coke in a trunk, and the guy said, oh, here's my keys, go search. Or in one case, they found some explosives on the turnpike, and they said it was a consent search. Well, the reality is what was happening was, if you looked at the numbers, the number of consent searches were out of balance, because the minorities were, number of consent searches per minority stop were like double and triple for the Caucasians. And it was obvious. And unfortunately, state police had a bounty system in effect where they were pre-budgeting an amount of money that they would make from selling seized property, the car, the cameras, the phones, and all of the bells and whistles that are in a car, because everything is forfeited. So they were making $10, $15 million a year that they were putting into their budget, and they were giving Trooper of the Year awards and all for those kinds of stops. So the system was heading in the wrong direction. When you abated the consent searches and said, no more, you got to have a real authorization from a judge if you're going to search in these cases, it all went away.
So you and Bill Gormley led a series of hearings that roundly roasted Peter Venero, who had been Attorney General at the peak of this practice.
He was more than Attorney General. He covered the whole practice up. He distorted the numbers. He put pockets of investigation in one hand and another one in a whole other jurisdiction, so that never the twain shall meet. And he
covered up.
He was the choreographer. Oh, absolutely. And he also lied about, which we finally caught him with, that he didn't know anything about the Justice Department investigation at the time he was nominated to be a Supreme Court justice, because I asked him the questions at the '99 hearings, and Chertoff came back and got him with those transcripts, where
that's right. Chertoff was involved too.
He had buried the letters that came from the Justice Department. Nobody else had them.
Chertoff was the special counsel to the committee,
right?
Yeah. And you went back at Venero a second time when he was.
No, that was it. Profile.
That was it?
First one was Supreme Court nomination in 1999. That's when we made a record. I had no tools. There was no Gormley. They gave us no subpoena power. I was a one-man band on the Judiciary Committee, and we couldn't get subpoena power. The Republicans wouldn't give it to us, so we couldn't get underneath a lot of things that he had been doing as Attorney General, which we had a whole cadre of them. And then, however, those transcripts, ultimately, when we did have subpoena power and we did get every document from the Attorney General's office, and more importantly from the state police for the profile hearings, this all then came out where Venero was, he was the puppeteer.
And did he come back for that second round of hearings as a Supreme Court justice? I don't recall.
Yes, he did.
He did.
Remember, he was almost impeached.
Yeah.
Collins thwarted the impeachment after the Senate voted to recommend it.
Right. Right. So that was your...
A Republican Senate.
That was your swan song, as it were, as a 20-year legislator, I guess.
That was it. Trying to help some of the younger people in the Senate that last year, but there's too many collateral stories about those things. But
and since then, tell us about your life since then.
I was a lawyer for 45 years. I had a law practice. It was fairly substantial, although like most law practices, if you have somebody that's in the legislature, you're conflicted from doing any business with the state or any of its agencies. So, I mean, no big firm can do that today. So I don't think our firm was ever more than 25 lawyers. So we did a lot of litigation, toxic torts, class actions, insurance defense, did some commercial practice and so forth and so on. I had consulting businesses, and then I had my problem with the law enforcement. And they sent me to graduate school for a couple of years, which someday when I'm no longer under the aegis of the court system, I will be very glad to talk about.
I'd like to talk to you about that someday.
Won't be long.
Okay. And now, what are you up to?
I still work for a electrical supply and energy company where Jackson Ogre, the president, used to serve with me in the Senate. Had been the chairman of the New Jersey Port Authority.
A Republican.
A Republican.
And
former mayor of East Brunswick. Very good friend of mine. Right. And I still help some other folks. And my wife has a business. She built a house down in Princeton when my son was going to Lawrenceville School. And yeah, everything's worked out very nicely.
And are you paying close
attention? I'm trying to age gracefully.
We all are.
Yeah.
Are you paying close attention to New Jersey politics?
On the periphery. Not the day-to-day trench warfare, as it were, but I still have some really serious interest in the public policy side of it. What needs to be done. You talk to some of the younger folks and try to paint the big picture and forget the partisan politics, why the state was mired in the malaise that it is, and the perception of being anti-business and so forth and so on, and the difficulty in dealing with the bureaucracies of local, county, and state government when you want to get anything done. And so many states have their hand out and say, how can we help you? New Jersey doesn't have that kind of a sign.
We don't normally ask people to comment on the current governor, but you're saying things that resonate with some of the things that he's out there saying all the time.
Well, I'm not a big fan, obviously, but in terms of where the state was going, where its redundancies are, how the inside operation, the institutional folks had taken over the system and were running the show, as it were, and you had legislatures that were afraid of them, or intimidated by them, or being shepherded by them because they get too immersed in the inside of Trenton game. And so you have the public employee unions, et cetera, who had just gotten out of hand. For instance, I had my wars with the NJEA. I don't have any wars with teachers. I think teachers are underpaid for the most part, and there aren't enough of them. But you have these immense bureaucracies in the schools, and 610 school districts with everybody's cousin and whatever on the payroll as the maintenance, cafeteria, this, all with benefits and so forth. And they're all represented by the same union. So the interests of the teachers sometimes get suppressed. If they had their own union bargaining for themselves and not this whole other system and bureaucracy, they'd do much better, and the focus could be a lot better. And I suspect they also would be more supportive of merit pay and those kinds of things. I mean, look at Kane, he ran into it just trying to go alternate route certifications. It was so clear that it made sense. So why are people contentious in trying to block it? I mean, we see those kinds of things all the time. So to the extent that the current governor is sees it, is challenging it, that is correct. I mean, there's so much more that has to be done, and maybe this was a first step in getting rid of the redundancies, because you could take some of the cream off the top, but you got to get into the substance of it and what's really driving the bus, and that's the redundancy of 566 local governments and 610 school districts. And that's why our property taxes are enormous. And if you look at the national rankings, I mean, we have like 17 of the top 25 counties in the country out of 1,000. 17 of the top 25, all central North Jersey, every bit of it.
In terms of property tax?
Yes, size of property tax. And the rest of the field is way down the road. I mean, the only counties that are up in that pack are, maybe Westchester, and 3 or 4 or 5 of those in the high rent districts of the east, and of course a handful in the west. And it just tells you, it's exactly what Tom Kean was saying. You can't be non-competitive. You can't have CEOs and others looking to locate New Jersey, or financial services institutions. They're going to look at your tax structure. They can go anywhere in today's world.
Well, that's also what Chris Christie is out there saying.
Well, he said that in the context of the millionaire's tax and the competitiveness. And you still have the defenders on the left who defend big government and defend all these things. And we saw some of that in one of the administrations that I served with, and it didn't have to do directly with the governor, but the people who are his think tanks are still running think tanks supporting the same notions.
Talking about John Corzine?
No.
Jim Florio?
Yeah.
Okay.
Corzine's a different story.
All right.
Why did he want to be governor?
To see what it was like.
He should have talked to Tom Kean. What's your mission? Why do you want to be there? What is it you want to accomplish? Because there's such a stark contrast.
Explain the contrast, and I think we'll end it on that note. Explain that contrast.
Kean went in with a notion of having learned from a variety of means what he thought the state needed to do, what direction it needed to take, where the investments needed to be made, higher ed, sci-tech, arts, infrastructure, environment, all with meaningful programs, and put some resources behind them. And that was his mission. And if you look at the composite of it, it had to do with economic development, every bit of it. There was a bottom line to all of it. I have no idea to this day what Corzine's program was. Why did he leave the U.S. Senate to come to New Jersey if you didn't have an agenda that you wanted to accomplish and you wanted to lead forward? I saw none of it. And I haven't seen anybody describe it otherwise in a meaningful way. I know exactly what Tom Kean did. Now, I was hands-on, don't get me wrong, but if you step back and look at it from afar, you can see it. You can see what happened and why it happened. I can't tell you what happened in the 4 years of John Corzine, other than trying to survive.
So Kean was the strongest leader you've seen?
In his way. Because he wasn't co-opted by a base political issue. You have to do that to campaign, don't get me wrong. And he did. But he also knew where he wanted to go with whatever political capital he had, and actual capital, as opposed to a willy-nilly approach of where's the wind blowing today.
Have you seen him at all in the last decade?
Who?
Have you seen Tom Kean at all in the last decade?
I saw him at the Eagleton, and I've had the pleasure of talking to him a couple times.
I imagine he would enjoy hearing what you think of his...
Well, he knows how I feel. He knows that.
All right. Well, now we know it too. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure.